but I'm going to go ahead and get us started because I do commit to starting on time and ending on time. My name is the Reverend David Pyle. I am York Central East Regional UUA Staff Governance Program Manager. I am several other things. We'll talk about those things in a minute, but most of you were in the workshop that we had the first session. I want to remind everybody that we are recording this. Beth, do we have the slides?
I'm getting them right now.
Thank you. So welcome to the Board Basics, to session 2 of the Board Basics course. I hope that we had some great questions that came out of the first session for the Board Basics course. I want to thank you all for that. We're making one change to session 3 based upon some feedback we got from session 1, and that was a request that we talk a little bit about contracting. About the board's responsibility to contract with ministers and with other professionals, and so we're going to add a little piece into session 3 for that. I wanted to acknowledge that that was a request you had, and we're adding that. So with that, I want to just do a quick introduction, not as fast as we did last time. As I said, my name is David. I have the privilege to have been a church geek who is good enough at it to get a job. And I am a Unitarian Universalist minister who served congregations in Illinois, in Michigan, and in Southern California before my second time serving on the UUA staff. And on your staff, I serve as the primary contact for the congregations of the Baltimore cluster, the Delmarva Peninsula cluster, and the Central Pennsylvania cluster. And among many roles, I am also your governance program manager. So that is, I support congregations on the kinds of issues of bylaws and structure and boards and committees and all of that. All of our primary contacts can do that at some level. I'm the person who designs our training for congregations on those things, as well as being a level of referral for all of your primary contacts. So with that, I also want to introduce my co-facilitator, Beth Casebolt, who many of y'all remember from lots of things, including last session. Beth, we take it away.
I am your operations manager and communications consultant for the region. I serve as primary contact for the Appalachian cluster, which is West Virginia and a few congregations in Maryland and Ohio that border there. And my portfolio, my program manager area is communication, social media, and that area. So that's me. I served as a DRE for a number of years. I am credentialed at the associate level for a very small congregation in the former Ohio Meadville district, and then moved into district administration. So
welcome. We really fast introductions from last time. Remember, I said last time I would love to do introductions to all of you with each other, and that would be the next 45 minutes of this meeting. So just to move us along and stay in the 90-minute time frame that we've committed to, we're going to go to the next slide and just say this is the agenda for this workshop today, for this webinar today. And that is, we're going to talk about adaptive challenges versus technical problems. And then we're going to talk about the balcony versus the dance floor. We're going to use some metaphors to understand some of the tensions that congregational boards work with. We'll talk about the nature of differentiation as a leader and the roles of confidentiality and transparency in congregations. I have a really good distillation of the Healthy Disclosure book that will be a 4-part process that congregational boards can go through in helping to decide what to disclose and how to disclose when it comes to sensitive information. We'll talk a little about linkage and the board covenant, or speaking as a board, speaking with one voice. We'll talk about voting and consensus process and healthy conflict for boards. So that's a pretty full time. We're going to just move through it. Remember, we are recording this workshop. In case you don't catch something the first time, it will be available to you and sent back out. So I want to remind you that the next session is on September 21st. We could go back one.
Sorry.
And just to know what we're going to do, the last session, remember we went really theory, then we're going to go into functioning is today. And then next session is really just going to be techniques, is tools. So in the next session, we're going to talk about how to read a congregational budget and profit loss statement. Now, I can't do that for every single congregation, but I can point you to some good tips. We'll talk about process observation, how you observe your process as a congregational board. We'll talk about the wonderful, powerful tool technique known as consent agenda and how to use it in a congregational board. We'll talk about board meeting versus board workshops, other ways of functioning as a board. Powerful questions as a technique and tool to think about the culture, mission, vision, identity, and of a congregation. Cottage meetings and town halls, board culture assessment, board roles and positions, and then open and executive sessions. And I want to add in there, we'll also talk about the board's contracting role. I want to remind everyone, please mute if you are not muted, especially if you're on the phone. It's important. I think we have a number 570-744-2823 we're getting a little feedback from. So thank you all. And thank you all for showing back up. You know, it's always, I say when I preach in congregations, I say, you don't only know how good you are when they invite you back a second time. So I'm glad you all are here. So just a few reminders for how we do this workshop. Beth is moving us. Is to first use the chat box to ask questions during the presentation. Either I or Beth will be watching the chat box as we go along, and we'll ask your questions into the webinar and do our best with them. The slide deck is designed to be both graphics and notes. So you're going to get a copy of this slide deck sent out tomorrow. So everything that's in there is, you know, available to you post. So if you feel free to take notes, and I take notes obsessively when I'm learning, that's great, but just know that everything will be sent back out to you. When you're sharing stories or questions, please remember your commitments to confidentiality. I cannot stress this enough. We are recording this workshop, and so if you ask a question or something that is very specific to your congregation, know that this is an open space, not a confidential space. Because the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the web, and presenters are available outside the webinar. Several of you contacted me after the last one, and those were great. Becca says you don't think there were notes on the last slide pack. The answer to that is the notes are the slides. We have integrated the notes into the slides instead of there being a separate thing. That was another question that came to us through email. So the really wordy slides are the notes. All right. But you know, whether we're in this webinar or not, we are your regional staff, and we encourage you to always reach out first to your primary contact. I hope everyone on this webinar knows who your primary contact is. But you know, if you can't find your primary contact, reach me or Beth, and we'll help you do that. But you know, we your regional staff are here to help your congregations fully live your mission and vision, and to be the presence of Unitarian Universalism across our country. And so we're here to walk with you in doing that, and we thank you all for your congregation's support to the annual program fund of the UUA that allows us to be here to walk with you. So if we could go to the next slide, just to say, I'm going to do this one slide on every, we can flip the next one. But I can do this one slide on every one, just to remind people of the assumptions underlying this workshop series. I believe that all of us carry biases. That's just a natural part of being human. And the best we can do is to be as public and as aware of our biases as possible, and people can judge things we say through that lens. So you saw these last time. I'll just say it one more time. The purpose of church is not governance. The purpose of church is, as the Reverend David Bumbaugh used to say, the salvation and the transformation of the world. That's my language. You don't have to own that. But it's the congregation's mission. It's creating the world made whole. And governance is good when it is serving that mission. So you could have the absolute best functioning, nicely put together governance system, but if it's not helping the congregation to better live its values and beliefs in the world, then it's not serving the purpose of the congregation, of the religious mission. It's one of the things I really do believe. It's one of my maxims of ministry. It's that culture is stronger than structure. It's that we can change congregational structure all we want to, but culture only changes when people change how they function. When people change how they function and the system adapts around that. So that though a lot of people who do governance work begin from a lens of structural change, I begin from a lens of functional change, of helping people to function differently in their congregational systems. And that, I think that's the most effective way of making congregational change, is by a small group of leaders who intentionally change how they are functioning and let the system adapt around that, which is a lesson that comes to us from family systems theory. And you'll hear, we're going to do a bit more family systems theory today, so hang with me. There's no single right way for a congregational governing board to function. I actually really believe this, and I think it's one of the beautiful things about who we are as Unitarian Universalists, is that we really are 1,000 different designed congregational systems. And the telling point for me is not if you do it in a particular way, but if it is serving your mission. If the way you are functioning is allowing you to best do your ministry in the world. And this is the one that I got a lot of pushback from last time, and I'm saying it again. I don't really believe in best practices. That doesn't mean I don't believe in good practices or practices that have worked well somewhere else. But I think that our congregations are so different and so unique and have such different cultures that saying something is a best practice implies it should work everywhere. And that's just not my experience. But I understand that other people don't accept that. So those are the assumptions that are underlying, and you can view the things we do together today and in the next session through that lens. So now I get to do probably one of my favorite metaphorical stories. Some people have seen me do this little story at General Assembly. I'm going to tell you all my story to explain the difference between adaptive challenges and technical problems. So who's heard, raise your hand or wave or something, if you've heard the phrases adaptive challenge or technical problem before. Nobody, wow. Becca waved her hand. All right, so let's imagine a day with me, if you will. You come into church on Sunday morning and the lights don't work. You're the first person in the building and you notice the lights aren't working. What do? Well, you wait, you find who the building person, right? Every congregation has building people, right? We know who they are. I'm a building person. You go, you find the building person. And the building person says, aha, I know what to do. The building person goes down to the fuse box. And the building person checks the fuse box and sees which fuse isn't working, and they flip the fuse box and the lights come back on. A technical problem. A problem for which there is knowledge that already exists, that when the knowledge is applied, it corrects the problem. It changes the problem. It is an actual solution. Now, the knowledge may not be immediately accessible. So let's say that the building person goes down to the fuse box and sees that all the fuses are fine. So the building person calls up maybe not before services, but maybe, you know, you might have some good context. The building person calls the electrician. And the electrician comes out. And the electrician says, aha, your problem's not your fuse box, your problem is here deeper in the lines, and here's what we do. And they use that technical knowledge to solve the problem. They send you a bill, but they use the technical knowledge to solve the problem. Still a technical problem for which knowledge that was accessible, when applied to the problem, solves the problem. All right, same situation, same Sunday morning, different scenario. You come into church on Sunday morning, and the lights are off. You find the building person goes and sees fuses all look fine. Building person calls the electrician. Electrician comes in and says, well, I can check the lines and stuff, but I think I know your problem. When I was driving in, I looked at the telephone pole and I saw the little tag that says the power's been cut off. And you say, oh, and then you call the power company and they say, well, nobody's paid the bill in 3 months. And you say, oh. And then you start looking into it and you find out that there is a dispute between the bookkeeper, the administrator, and the treasurer, and somebody has taken the checkbook home and hid it. This is a real story. And no one will admit to who took the checkbook home or why. There's a conflict over the relationships and the authority. There's some personality stuff that has come into it. And it's just kind of this big relational mess. So this is an adaptive challenge. This is a challenge for which there will need to be adaptation of relationship in order to make progress on a solution, in order to get closer to a problem, in order to get closer to resolving this. Now, every adaptive challenge has some technical problems within it. Somebody has to find that checkbook and write some checks. Because you've also found they haven't paid lots of other people in this 3 months, right? So usually a technical problem that identifies an adaptive challenge usually identifies a whole lot more technical problems and a much larger adaptive challenge. So it can seem in some ways overwhelming, not just because it's got many different aspects to it, but also because it involves people. And another one of my maxims of ministry, people are messy, right? It involves relationship, and it's going to involve relational adaptation. So if we go to the next slide. So in understanding a technical problem, it's a known solution that can be resolved, accessed and resolved with knowledge and expertise. It has the necessary expertise may be present in the group, or it may be accessible from outside of the group. But when the necessary knowledge is applied, it solves the problem. An adaptive challenge is a dissonance of problems that will require a change in relationships and or human functioning to effect. Sometimes you find an adaptive challenge when you see a problem and you start applying technical fixes, because we have a natural tendency to want to apply technical fixes, and the technical fixes don't solve the problem. I mean, you could find that checkbook and you could write the checks and the technical problem will be solved. The power comes back on, but the problem, the challenge, is actually still there because the relationships have not adapted, right? The core element, everything else is a symptom of this relational challenge. One of the reasons why I start with this is because a lot of the challenges that boards face begin looking like technical problems. And we naturally want to be able to go right to that solution. And then they find that the solution doesn't affect, or as someone once said to me in a conversation, it's like the problem keeps squishing out somewhere else. That we solve this one problem, we fix this piece, but now something else is happening over here. Or you fix this, and now it's up here. It was between these two people, but now it's over here between these two people. Because the problem is not what it first appears to be. The problem is deeper in human relationship. And, this is a blessing for us in the fact that relationship is what religious community does. And once we begin to realize that this is one of the spiritual components of serving in congregational leadership, is the ability to make the transition from looking at the technical problem towards the relational challenges. And there is no easy solution often to the relational challenges. We go to the next slide. So it's a natural human tendency to first view the adaptive challenge as technical problems. One of the things that I invite board members to do is to get this lens and hold this lens about adaptive challenges. And when you start seeing a problem before your governing board, begin asking yourself this question: is this really a technical problem? Or is there an adaptive challenge behind this? A lot of frustration happens for governing boards around misidentifying what is the problem. It takes intentionality to look for the ways that relationship and human functioning need to change in order to engage in the adaptive challenge. So it is more than just the board passing a motion. It's more than a decision. It's about doing the deep work of relationship. In the metaphor that I use, in the story that I use, which really is a true story, the second one, the fuse boxes happen for everybody, the power being off because the fuse is blown, but what it took was some mediation support to find out what was the relational challenge between the treasurer, the bookkeeper, and the administrator. And then to realize with a little bit deeper struggle that there were some technical pieces to it, that those three roles were not clearly defined. And those roles not being clearly defined created relational tension and misunderstandings and people taking things personally. And now it had devolved to the point where somebody felt in crisis and took control by taking the checkbook home, right? So there was none of your congregation, so don't worry about it. So the core is that some adaptive challenges, though, may never be solved in the sense of being solved, because human relationships are not a problem to be solved. They're a reality to be lived and experienced. And so the best you can sometimes do is to go deeper in understanding, to seek an understanding of the challenge and live in that tension. And for boards who really want to solve problems, this can be very frustrating. Adaptive challenges will, I believe, often point governing boards towards the congregation's identity, culture, mission, and vision. That we talk a lot about how you discern as a congregational leader, congregation's mission, vision, identity, and culture. And I love to say that adaptive challenges occur because of things that you really find of value within your community. In that, when this congregation, in the example I'm using, there was a value of authority and autonomy that was challenged by this unclarity of roles. And so it points to, for that congregation, having empowered leaders and having empowered staff was a part of their identity. And when that felt challenged, relationship came into conflict. Sometimes the way to work on adaptive challenges involves not solving a technical problem. So I'm not doing a class in anxiety theory as part of this board basics. If you are interested in that, we have a wonderful course called Healthy Leadership as part of the UU Leadership Institute, uuinstitute.org. We can put that in the chat box, I think, right, Beth? Mm-hmm. So they called Healthy Leadership, that part of that Healthy Leadership course goes deep into anxiety theory and understanding how anxiety works in congregations. But one of the things that I wanted to name is that if you solve some technical problems too fast and it lowers the temperature on the discomfort created by the adaptive challenge, then people are not motivated to actually do the relationship work. So there is an art to understanding whether maybe you want to do a Sunday with the lights off and no sound. So that maybe you don't, but so that people are motivated to work on the relationship. If you solve too many technical problems too fast, then there can be less motivation. And sometimes communications disconnect occurs between those who see the adaptive challenge and those who only see technical problems. If you really only understand things through the lens of technical problems, and you see a bunch of people who, instead of fixing the fuse box or finding the checkbook, are instead bringing people together to talk about relationships and how you all are interacting and maybe covenanting together, it can feel like it's wasting time because you only see the technical problem, right? So this is the first lens I want you all to hold in our thinking about today. And one thing about today's session is that we are building up to something. So hang with me. Just put this one in your toolbox, and we'll come back. All right. So let's go to another lens for you. And Beth, you're going to start us on this one. I think.
So this is called being on the balcony versus dancing on the dance floor. And it's a metaphor we often use to help people understand one of those conundrums that is really common for congregations and not for other nonprofits. If you remember last time when we met, we talked about how it's really hard for nonprofits, for those in churches rather than nonprofit boards. We don't function the same way because we're already members and we actively integrate with everybody who are part of the organization, whereas most nonprofit boards don't do that. They don't interact with the clients much. They don't interact with the staff very much. They have some separation. And so this is a metaphor we use to help you see what's going on with what's in the bigger picture. So, for example, when you're on the dance floor, you can really only see the people you're interacting with and the people directly around you. You can't see what's happening on the other side of the room. You can't see what other people are doing very clearly. When you get up on the balcony, you can see different people interacting in different ways. You can see how different groups that work together, and you can see how things are coming in, people kind of pass each other and come back apart. And so that's an important thing for a board member to be able to do, to make that shift between being on the dance floor as a member and then being on the balcony as a board member. And I want to also point out that we actually use this metaphor I teach the Renaissance module for RE, Administration and Religious Education, and we use this metaphor there. And there we actually tell our people to draw a picture of the dance floor and who's interacting with who and what groups are interacting with what groups, and then to take that to a staff meeting and have it as a conversation. And that's also a great exercise for a board to do. Draw those pictures and then talk about it and see how you all see the interaction of the different groups of the congregation together. So a dance floor view is seeing mostly those you are dancing with and those who are closest to you. It's the folks who are in closest proximity. In the case of you guys, it would be what committees you currently interact with and what committees you serve on and who are the people that you run around with and talk to the most on a Sunday morning. Engaging primarily with that particular dance that you and the others are doing, and assuming that everybody else is doing the same dance you are, that there are no wallflowers, for example. And also seeing your dance out of proportion to the rest of the dance floor. We tend to see ourselves and our dance as the most important on the dance floor when it very well may not be. The balcony view allows you to see all of the dance floor and all the dancers. And you can see how the different groups of dancers are interacting with each other. You can see how the wallflowers are hanging back and not interacting with people. You can see ways that changes in the music affects all of the dancing system. And so that means you can see, okay, if we change the tempo, who drops out? If we slow it down, who comes back in? So think about that. And then making changes to your dance hall environment might make the dance better for everyone if you think about that as well. What kinds of environmental changes can you make in your congregation that might enhance everything? If you add a sound system, now everybody can hear, so they can hear the music better. So those are some things to think about. One of the examples I've often used when talking about this is that if you have an RE committee who wants to increase social justice work and opportunities in your RE classes, and you have a social justice committee that's doing social justice work, it kind of seems to me like a no-brainer the two should be talking to each other, because you've got these people who understand social justice and these people who understand developmental issues of children, and you should be able to put the two together and come up with some great ideas. And it's surprising how often those two groups never dance together at all. They're on opposite sides of the dance floor. And so if you get yourself out of that being on the floor and look at things from the bigger picture, it gives you the greater opportunity to see who is interacting with each other and who isn't, and maybe who should be interacting with each other and who shouldn't. Or well, actually everybody should be interacting with it, but who should be doing more of that. So those are some things. This is another metaphor to put in your toolbox and think about.
And I'm a preacher, so we can torture a metaphor completely. I wanted to add a piece, and that is that as a board member, you have to intentionally make this transition. And when I was with one of my congregational boards, I would begin board meetings by reminding people, let's get up on the balcony, right? As part of the beginning. It's just a reminder that we naturally are doing our work, living most of our time in our congregation in those interactive spaces, in those places that we are most connected. And the need for board members to look at the entirety of the congregational system. So,
right. So making that shift up and down is very, very important. And making sure that you can integrate what you learn as a balcony observer into your day, what you're doing when you're down on the dance floor as well.
So
all right.
So I want to transition us. We're giving you all some things to hold on to. Just hang with me. Put that one in your tool bag for the moment. We'll talk about differentiation. Differentiation is a large word, but what it really means in family systems theory is the ability to see yourself as separate from the emotional system of the communities you're a part of. To be part of that emotional system and yet not fully encapsulated by it. Now, differentiation is something that takes some time for many people to grasp the concept here. When we do this in the Healthy Congregations in-person workshop series, differentiation was an 8-hour day, really focused on just that topic. So I'm going to touch on the idea here. It's the idea that every congregation or group of human beings creates an emotional system of interlocking relationships. So whether it's your family, whether it is even, I think, people standing in line at the grocery store when things are going slow or somebody has spilled something, they create an interlocking system of emotional relationships that are often communicated not just in words, but in body language and tone and feel. It is a natural aspect of understanding of human systems theory. And in congregations, which is a wonderful book, it's long, but every minister has to read it. It's called Generation to Generation by Rabbi Edwin Friedman. That is a full treatment of family systems theory as applies to congregations. If you're a big church geek and you want to read something that's kind of a couple hundred pages, it's a worthwhile read. But the core element of there is that each person in the system is affected by this emotional field at both a conscious and an unconscious level. So one way to live this is, I'm sure all of you all have experienced anxiety in congregations. Anxiety in congregations is a normal thing, and it's actually a sign that your congregation is still alive, because the only way you don't have anxiety is if you're not alive anymore. As the anxiety in the congregational system might rise, even someone who is not connected to the direct source of the anxiety or not affected by it still feels that anxiety within themselves, can still hold that energy, because that's part of how we live and communicate as human beings. It affects us at both a conscious and an unconscious level. And the key to differentiation is the awareness of a self that is separate from the system, that I can still be part of the system and yet not be fully encapsulated by it, have part of me that is still just me. We can go to the next slide. It takes intentional self-awareness as a leader, and it also takes intentionality in maintaining relationships. Because when this goes too far, it becomes an emotional cutoff where you're not connected to the system anymore, where you've separated. And most times when people reach emotional cutoff in congregational systems, they stop coming. Right? So they've differentiated to the extreme that they're no longer part of the religious community. This is the key of having enough of a sense of self-awareness that you can see and even analyze a bit the congregational system as it's happening around you and feel part of that and not feel fully swept away by it. Be able to step one step out of it. Like I said, when we teach this in healthy congregations or healthy leadership, in person, it's really an 8-hour day. So hang with me. Are you all getting the basic concept of what I'm saying? We've lived this in some ways, and all of us have times where we are more differentiated than others. I will say I am least differentiated in family conflict. I am least able to see myself as separate when there is anxiety and tension in my family. And I've learned to be more differentiated in congregational conflict. As regional staff, I'm often the most differentiated person in the room because I'm not actually a member of the congregation, right? But the healthy leaders, the ones who serve as really great board members, are the ones who can hold this sense of differentiation when the congregational system is in times of anxiety, crisis, and challenge. And it is those who can hold that sense of self that are the needed, as Reverend Peter Steinke often would say, are the needed white blood cells in the congregational system, are the needed centers of helping the congregational system to remain healthy and whole. It takes self-differentiation as a leader, and the governing board must really, I think, in order to do its work well, to do its discernment well, It has to be able to look at the emotional system of the congregation from this balcony view. To be able to say in the board meeting, the anxiety's really been rising in the congregation. What do we think that's about? What might be the sources and places about that? And how can we positively affect it? How can we help that anxiety find useful and good outlets? That takes a level of awareness. When one of the people who might be highly anxious and not differentiated at all in the issue that's happening in the congregation might well be your spouse or your children, because we have those deep connections within the congregation. So this is a challenging thing we're asking. Go to the next slide. So a leader in a congregation is a person who can most influence the congregation's emotional field by responding to crisis with calmness, inertia with challenge, bewilderment with focus, and new conditions with change and adaptation. There's many things I love from my predecessor, the Reverend Dr. Richard Speck, but this formulation is one that I really do like. And it's the idea that you as a leader are, to use Reverend Peter Steinke's metaphor, you're a white blood cell in the congregational system. And sometimes that is to motivate people when there is entirely too much apathy, when everything is great and there's no motivation to change anything. Sometimes it is to bring some focus into times of confusion and bewilderment. And confusion and bewilderment, frankly, happens a lot in our congregations, right? And usually followed by anger. Just saying. That's called emotional substitution theory. We're not going to go there today. And to new conditions with change and adaptation is that when to be the group who is differentiated enough to see when things are changing, when the demographics and the community around you have changed, and then to begin thinking through, okay, how are we as a congregation, how does our identity change when, say, the demographics around us change? That is the Congregational Board's work in discerning the mission, vision, identity, and culture of the congregation. So next slide. So I like this little list. And I'm going to say that when I read this again a couple days ago as I was putting the slides together, I'm just going to own that I saw our nation's political climate in a completely different way. So I'm not going to say anything more about that, but I'm going to say that an undifferentiated leader tends to be one that is reactive and instinctive, one that acts in covert ways, is demanding and stubborn, thinks in binaries, and us versus them, right versus wrong, is impatient, puts responsibility on others, is uptight and defensive, competitive, vague and non-specific in what they want and what they'll do, and often creates one-sided solutions to problems that this is the only way it can be solved, right? There's no other option. Now, do we know people like this? Right? I'm not going to say anything else because I'm under Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Look it up if you're interested. But you know, a differentiated leader tends to be someone who is more responsive and intentional, more overt in how they act. With their motivations and their biases, they try to make them clear. They're flexible and adaptable, open to a range of ideas instead of just a binary, allow for process, allow for people to take time and for a process to possibly change something other than what they thought it would be. They take responsibility for themselves. They're relaxed and at ease, tend to be collaborative, have clear and objective goals, clear in their objective, and they tend to create common goals. That it's not just about what I want. Now it's a cute little list, but I know that I am usually somewhere in between these two. And I do my best to be closer on the differentiated side, but all of us have times where we are more differentiated than others. All of us have times and places and spaces where we're less differentiated, where frankly, it doesn't matter if it's not really about me, it feels like it's about me, right? And so the key here is being aware enough to breathe and over time remind yourself and call yourself back to that differentiated space. One of the things I learned from my wife's tradition as a Zen Buddhist is the idea isn't that you practice the meditation practice perfectly, because no one ever does. No one in history has ever practiced Zen Buddhist meditation perfectly. The actual practice is in recognizing when you're not and recommitting to the practice. This operates the same way. It's recognizing when I'm really not being very differentiated here, and I want to be differentiated, and I'm going to come back to trying to be a more differentiated leader. Next slide. So everybody breathe for a second. Let it out. Remember, it's like a fire hose. We're putting lots of stuff to you in these webinars. I trust you. I think we're actually going to bring this all together by the end of the webinar today, but I wanted to talk about one of the most common questions that we get as congregational life staff. And it is one of the, if you notice, we've built this entire webinar section, session 2, is built around dynamic tensions. Is built around the tensions that congregational boards experience and trying to name how you navigate those tensions. And one of the most common tensions that we find is the tension between confidentiality and secrecy. The idea behind what is necessarily confidential and when confidentiality is not confidentiality, but it's secret keeping. Confidentiality, I'm just going to say a bias at the beginning, confidentiality is necessary and vital in religious community. Mm-hmm. Secret keeping is toxic. And the two are not the same, although it can be hard to discern the place between them. So confidential information is information that is withheld from disclosure to create space for necessary work and transformation. Its purpose is to create a space for change and adaptation to occur. Its purpose is creative. Now, there is such a thing as legal confidentiality, which is imposed by law, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I mean different kinds of confidentiality. I mean more spiritual confidentiality. An example that a congregational board might face with this kind of confidentiality is the treasurer comes and lets everybody know that they are facing an ethics investigation in their job, and they're going to resign from the treasurer, but they would like to not yet publicly say what's going on with that because they have some of their own work to do. They need a little space to be able to adapt to it, figure out what their process is going to be. They're resigning as treasurer because there is this ethics question in another part of their life, but they're not yet ready to live that within the congregational community. Is one example of a time where they might have told the board why they were resigning and asked the board to hold that confidentiality for a little bit of time while they did some necessary work. Confidentiality exists where it is information where the benefits of disclosure to the system are outweighed by the negative personal impacts upon an individual or individuals within the system, right? So as a board, one of the things that you are doing is you're weighing those two things. I like this example of the treasurer who has an ethics investigation because you could make a case that it is important that the possible damage to the system outweighs that personal challenge. In this case, I don't think so because, and if anything, the treasurer is showing a lot of really good ethics in choosing to resign amidst this situation, right? And will not be in that leadership position any longer, and has disclosed to the board what is the reason behind their resignation. So the board, the fiduciary, is aware, right? But the board may make the decision to hold that information confidential, at least for a while, because the congregation doesn't really have a great need to know what is happening in the personal professional life of that leader. It's often a temporary restriction, although not always. In the case of the treasurer, and this is also a true story, in the case of the treasurer, he eventually did the work, and he came before the congregation and actually said it in Joys and Sorrows about a month and a half later, right? That this was happening in his life, and and the congregation then held him, and he was eventually cleared in his professional work. But so to understand this is, now there is such a thing as legal confidentiality, especially around employment issues. And I'm going to say that there are some problems for which there is no easy solution for congregational boards. And legal confidentiality around employment decisions is one of the places where boards often face a lot of congregational conflict and challenge, where you legally can't reveal certain things about the ending of someone's employment under certain state laws. It's different in different states depending on state law. Kind of nodding heads, do you get the basic concept behind confidentiality? All right. So secret information is information that is withheld for the purpose of creating or altering power dynamics within the system. I often tell people when I teach this in in-person workshops, I can't tell you exactly whether something is being withheld for confidentiality reasons or secrecy reasons, but if you feel it and if you feel icky in your gut, you probably know the answer, right? If you feel manipulated by it, then that's a good indicator, because human beings can sense those things. It's often used as a way to bind individuals together through shared access to the secret information. It's one of the dynamics of building enmeshed relationships in congregations is you're the two people who know something secret, right? And that secret then begins to bind you together. It creates division within the system that leads to distrust, and it advantages one person or group over others within the system. So really, I think, when you're thinking about information that is being withheld and that power is being affected by that, power dynamics in the congregation are being affected by that, at that point, you're talking about secret keeping. Do you see the difference we're drawing between these two? Between and this is fuzzy. I'm telling you all, this is some of the hard discernment work the congregational boards have to do. And we give you this tool so that you know to ask this question, is so that when you are doing good discernment about information within a congregation, you're able to ask the question, is this confidential in order to create the space for people to do good work, necessary adaptation and transformational work? Or is something secret because there's a power dynamic attached to it? And to be able to hold that as a lens from which to try and discern through this. I'll tell you, this is also one of the places where congregational boards most often find themselves in conflict, is around this discernment between confidentiality and secrecy. It's also true, and I'll go to the next slide, that appropriate confidentiality by a governing board can feel like inappropriate secret keeping based upon the congregation's trust in the board. So one of the things I say is perception is 9/10 of ministry. That there is, in congregations that have a high level of trust of congregational leaders, or at least even a medium level of trust of congregational leaders, they are far more likely to understand and accept that the governing board may have a reason for keeping appropriate confidentiality. In congregations where trust between congregational leaders and the congregation feels like it has been broken at some point, that it's not at a high level or a medium level, then many people would perceive even appropriate confidentiality as secret keeping, because they are reliving the instances that created those past distrusts. That doesn't change the fact that you still need to be able to create the appropriate space for people to do transformational work, but it means how it could be perceived through the lens of previous experience. Congregations that manage information well are more likely to be trusted with exercising appropriate confidentiality. I've always been amazed by this. There are some congregations and some congregational boards who really do use healthy disclosure to communicate well. And over time, the congregation trusts. If you communicate well about things, then the congregations trust that you are going to continue to communicate well about things when it's appropriate that you're doing so. And Beth, this is your area, so if you need to jump in, you go right ahead.
No, you got it right. That's exactly the issue.
If good communication builds up a reservoir of trust that then can be useful to the board in times where maybe you can't fully communicate. Maybe that there are some places where there is appropriate confidentiality. And individuals also carry their own history related to power that can affect perception about appropriate confidentiality versus secret keeping. The whole congregation, the overall congregation may react well to something being held appropriately confidential, but a few individuals who have traumatic experience in their past may not. And understand that that is to be responded to with love and care, that is pastoral in nature. And it's often never framed that way in how it is expressed to the governing board, right? And once again, then you have accusations may be made to the governing board of secret keeping, which can then feel personalized and can challenge your differentiation. See how we're beginning to see how this flows together. And there are cultural differences that relate to how individual systems react to the line between confidentiality and secrecy. I'll tell you that our congregations, Unitarian Universalism is not a monoculture, either within our congregations themselves or within the different congregations. And so, in the congregations I served in the Midwest, they were generally pretty good with trusting congregational boards, unless there was some painful history in the past. In the congregations that I have served out here, I think that's less so. I think that there is more skepticism of authority in some of the congregations of the Central East region. In the congregation I served in Southern California, frankly, people didn't want to know what the board was doing. We have other things to do. We've elected you to deal with that, right? So realize that there is a cultural difference in different congregations, and you really have to be able to do some good discernment about your own congregational culture. So I want to talk a little bit about some of that communication. And Beth, this is another place where you may jump in. And that is the idea that the board's work around communications is healthy disclosure, is being able to, and you can transition to the next slide. Okay. There we go. Is being able to have a good plan for how you think through what to disclose, what it is important and appropriate to share with congregations. Notice there's a word I haven't used yet that is very common in our congregations. I'm going to bookmark it. It's called transparency. I'm going to talk about transparency in a minute. First, I'm going to talk about healthy disclosure. And you are, as a board member, you are an information trustee of the congregation. What that means is that you as a board member are given a greater access to information than most congregation members have. And frankly, greater than most congregation members want until something's wrong, right? In most cases, they want you to have the information and until they're mad about something, and then they want the information and want to know why they didn't have it before. But you are a trustee in the sense not only that you're protecting the information, but also that you are discerning through what is necessary and appropriate to be able to share and how to share that information. So healthy disclosure does not mean that all things must be disclosed all the time. Mm-hmm. And frankly, all things should not be disclosed all the time. All things being disclosed all the time is a great way to make sure that nobody pays attention to anything. And one of your roles as an information trustee is to do good discernment about what it is most important for the congregation members to know, and to really view their attention span, the level at their bandwidth, the level at which they can receive as a resource to be protected. Because when they really need to know it, they really need to know it. And if it's been a lot of stuff, then that's come before that. So the board collectively makes decisions about healthy disclosure. You must be conscious about what information the board has, must be intentional about what information the board, what the board does with the information it has, and analyze your own motivations, both as individuals and collectively, for disclosing the information or withholding it. The board must clearly articulate to the congregation the information which the board has and does not have access to, and the reasons for those differences. One of the big pieces is that congregation members often don't understand that the board doesn't necessarily have access to all the information. There are many cases in which the board doesn't. A staff member may have reasons for not sharing something with the board. This most often comes up around ministerial search, where the board may not have access to all the information, and around the reasons for a ministerial departure, where the minister may not have shared the reasons why they're leaving, or another staff member, or someone else, or there may be restrictions upon what the board can share itself. And the board must consider all the aspects of privacy, confidentiality, and efficacy while seeking to be open and transparent as possible in varying circumstances. That's a big job, right? There's a wonderful book on this. I'm not expecting you to go read it, but it's called Healthy Disclosure. There's a picture of the book on the screen by Kimmy Simmons-Ruth and Karen McClintock. And it is kind of a great textbook. If you're ever looking for a good common board read, I think this is a good common board read about every 3 years as the board changes over. So next slide. So I'm just going to name a few things that, just so that we have some commonality of terms. Rumors. Rumors are misinformation. There are rumors in congregations. I love rumors because rumors will tell you what people are worried about. Rumors are one of the greatest signs of the direction of congregational anxiety that you can possibly create. Pay attention to the rumors, not because you think they're true, because they tell you what people are scared about in the congregation. Gossip, which may be accurate, but it's spread outside of established communication channels. Gossip is does the same thing that secrecy does, in that it creates those enmeshed relationships. Gossip binds people together in the same way that secrets bind people together. Mm-hmm. The difference is the gossip isn't secret. The gossip can be shared, and the gossip is designed to be shared. So exposure, which is revealing too much information that would be considered socially appropriate. For example, it had the board members then sent out an email, a congregation-wide email about that treasurer that said, Dan is in trouble with his work, and so he's stepping down as the treasurer. That could be a form of exposure, right? That is, it's too much information and would be necessarily appropriate. And leaking is information which is released intentionally without regard to confidence or established boundaries. I have another situation that unfortunately also involves the treasurer. I need another congregational position to pick on, where the treasurer decided he did not like the budget that he had proposed to the board. He and the finance committee proposed to the board for the annual meeting. And so he leaked elements of the board's discussion about that budget in an effort to get it where it wouldn't succeed at the congregational meeting, so that he could go back and rework the budget with the new ideas he had since the finance committee meeting, right? So he leaked information that was within the covenant of board discussion, outside of the board's covenants and agreements. We get the basic. I won't like to define these things because they kind of get mushed up in congregations. So go to the next slide. So there are 5 levels of information disclosure, and I'm giving you a fire hose. Remember, you're going to have all of these slides. Private information, only you know it. If more than you know it, it's not private anymore, especially in today's social media world. Once you've told somebody else, it then becomes confidential. Confidential is where it's released to a second person with assurance that it won't be shared without express permission, right? When that treasurer came to the congregational board, he told them this so that they would know it, but this was not actually confidential. He told them this under the express request that it not be shared, which made it limited access, known by 3 or more people, but protected from distribution by agreement, right? So that it's been shared with a group of people, but there isn't a formal agreement in place about what its distribution is. Open information is shared openly with the congregation, but is not easily accessible to the public. Congregations have lots of information that should be open, right? The congregational budget, or if there is a challenge if the congregation's facing a legal dispute, there should be, but probably does not need to be public. In other words, does not need to be uploaded to the congregational website. I have
Or printed in the middle of the newsletter.
Or printed in the middle of the newsletter. I will say that things like exit interviews with staff may need to be open, but certainly do not need to be public, right? That's just one example.
One of our colleagues calls that airing your dirty laundry. You don't want to leave your dirty laundry laying around in the front living room when people come to visit. We shouldn't be putting these kinds of information out in general into the general public.
It happens about every year. During when congregations are in search for a new minister, what happens is that 20 to 30 ministers obsess over their website. And they go through and view every last thing on their website. And then I get an email saying, do you know this is on their website? Right? And the congregation didn't know it was on their website, whatever it happens to be. So something that was, because we forget that our websites are not internal to us. They are external, even though we often use them for internal purposes. So next slide. So if I have a thing that I most want to gift to you all tonight, for you all to take with you and keep with you, it is this. And I recommend that congregational boards take these next 2 slides, or 3 slides, and clip them out and keep them somewhere in your boardroom. Maybe laminate them so that you can pull this out when you need it. This is a 4-part decision-making process for disclosure. This is disclosure decisions about information. And it's a little hokey. Hang with me, because the reason why it's a little hokey is because when you're making difficult disclosure decisions, the anxiety is high. And so you need a cheat sheet, right? You need something to walk you through a process, because when the anxiety rises in human beings, we tend to lose details. We tend to lose track of details. So first step, assess the specific situation. State the situation and/or dilemma as succinctly as possible. And I have one congregation that's actually taken these 4 pieces and broke them out into boxes, where then they write beneath the box what it is the piece that they want to do. I then told them they need to shred those afterwards. So state the situation and/or dilemma as succinctly as possible. Number 2, determine who knows what. 3, identify all the relevant facts, such as what is the source of the information, who owns the information, who has a right to the information, and who has a need to know the information. What history and background is pertinent to the situation, what information is missing. That piece right there, number 3, is a really, really important conversation for the board to have in making sensitive disclosure decisions, because that will point you to all the other answers. You determine whether anyone is at risk of foreseeable harm. Who will be harmed by our disclosure? That doesn't necessarily stop you from making the disclosure. Remember, you have to make a judgment about relative harm to the congregational system and relative harm to individuals. Investigate the applicable rights and rules, policies, laws, and so forth. There sometimes are laws, especially around employment decisions, about what you can disclose and what you can't. And I will tell you, in the midst of a difficult congregational termination of a beloved staff member, no one but you is going to care about those laws. And you only are going to care about it because of your fiduciary responsibility. But the congregation, even I've had HR professionals in congregations tell me they didn't care about what the law said at church, right? Because they wanted to know why their beloved director of religious education was being let go. So that's step 1, all of that, and that's usually a good board discussion, an important board discussion to have. Step 2, consider the options and determine the plan. I don't know how many times congregations have gone into disclosure and they actually didn't have a plan. The plan was somebody just sent a congregational-wide email, but there was not a lot of discernment that went behind that. So why conceal or reveal the information? Who is the most appropriate person to disclose the information? To whom should the information be disclosed? It doesn't necessarily always have, I'm going to use as an example one that was public in a second. What details or information will be shared or withheld? When should the information be released, and how is the information disclosed? The example I'm going to use, some of you may remember it, not many of you all, some of you are from the Joseph Priestley District, but a couple years ago, we had a a major series of issues within the youth programs of the Joseph Priestley District come to light. Those issues were all, what it really was some youth advisors, adult youth advisors, were not reporting rule violations between youth for a period of years. And what came out was that for years there had been many rule violations by youth within the program that were never addressed, that were in many ways suppressed by some youth advisors. And so we had to walk through this process. You know, what was the appropriate thing for us to share? What should we conceal or reveal? Who is the most appropriate person to disclose this information? Was it me as the district executive? Was it Reverend Evan Carvel-Zemer as the youth programs advisor, as the youth programs coordinator? Was it someone on UUA senior staff? What details or information will be shared or withheld? Well, for example, we made the determination that we shared what our youth advisors had done, but did not share any details about what the rule violations between youth were, because we determined that that would put youth at harm. That would, you know, the youth who were underage at that time, we addressed it, we worked with them, we did the investigations, but that there wasn't a need for that information to be shared with the broader congregations. We also did not do an all congregations email. We sent an email to the religious professionals with a request that they send a separate letter to the parents and the youth who were involved in those cons, in those youth cons, where rule violations had occurred, right? So when should the information be released? And that included when we did updates over a period of time as we conducted the investigations and moved forward, and updates went out over a period of about 7 months as we kept people in the loop of, and including the decision I made to suspend all overnight cons within the district. And how and where is the information disclosed? So those are the kinds of questions you then engage about creating a plan. Once you have a plan, you then act, and then you come back and step forward and evaluate. Was the decision made carefully in consideration of all people involved and the whole congregation? Were you able to maximize good and minimize harm? And was it an authentic decision based on truth and trust? And I will say that, you know, at the end of that process, when I and some of the other leaders who were involved in those decision-making came together and had those conversations, we learned where we had made mistakes, where we could have been better. And I think that Beth, you've been involved in some of this. I think that experience informed some of the ways that we have since communicated about certain issues that have come out within the regional programs.
The other thing I'm going to put in there, because this example uses it, when minors are involved, the rules change.
Yep.
There's even legal, that's another area where there may be laws that you cannot disclose things because it's a minor.
Right.
So you have to be careful with that as well.
Which is why I like using that example, because one, it doesn't touch on any particular congregation and it's ours, right? So this is a tool that I'm hoping that you all take from this conversation. Like I said, the congregations that have shown me their laminated copies of this have warmed my soul, that they keep in their board books. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about transparency. This is another one of the places where I get pushback, and so I'm just owning that there is pushback. You said, can you please say something about spouses serving on the same board, boundaries and disclosure? Oh, that was privately to me, I'm sorry. But you asked me to say it in the whole thing, Gene. So let's just say that I usually don't recommend that spouses serve on the board together, and the reason for that is not one of disclosure and boundaries. It's one of having one household having an overweight of opinion on the board. However, I happen to know that Gene's congregation is very small, and that you kind of, yours is a special case in some ways. So what I would just encourage you all to do would be to have good boundaries, that you do not you don't caucus outside of the rest of the board, that you have discussions about board business within the board, not just at home by yourselves. So transparency. Transparency is a different way than healthy disclosure to try and address disclosure. It is disclosure where the need for the discernment, the need for doing the assessment of understanding what's appropriate and when, and who it should be shared to and who it shouldn't be, that is not the board's responsibility. Transparency sets the ideal that all information should be disclosed unless you are legally prevented from doing so. And frankly, in some of our congregations, that last part isn't even true. That they believe that all information that the congregation should function in some ways as a board of the whole. The transparency creates a standard of access to information rather than a standard of good communication by the governing board. So you see the two standards here, that access to information in transparency thinking is the highest priority, rather than the board doing good discernment and good communications. I think transparency, when it's really practiced, actually lessens the congregation's ability to have an understanding of what is occurring in the congregation, because it's too much. Mm-hmm. Because there's too much to sort through. And they tend to respond to congregational issues from only a cursory understanding, because that's all that they have the ability to absorb in the time period, especially since they only really care when the anxiety has risen. And we know that when anxiety rises, our attention to detail kind of goes away as human beings. So you then have transparency congregations who experience the congregation making decisions based upon a limited understanding of the situation. And transparency puts the onus of discernment upon each individual congregation member to determine what is important and what is not, rather than trusting the board as information trustees of the congregation to do that discernment. Right? I want to say this, though. Transparency is almost always a necessary step in rebuilding trust in a governing board. That when a governing board is dealing with trust issues within the congregation, where the congregation has distrust of the governing board in its past or history, the boards usually have to go to some significant transparency to begin rebuilding that trust. So I think transparency is sometimes a necessary step. It's, for me, not the ideal. Does that make sense? So just spend a few minutes on linkage. I talked a little bit about linkage in the last session. I'm just going to name it. Linkage is a word that basically is used in corporate governance systems and nonprofit governance systems to describe congregation members, to describe the way that the board relates to and communicates with constituents of whatever the institution serves, be it the stakeholders of a nonprofit or the shareholders of a corporation. In institutions where you don't have the members of the congregation having the interlocked relationships with the board members being members of the institution, then you have to have formal plans for linkage. There has to be formal processes by which the board communicates with stakeholders and the board communicates with shareholders. In congregations, however, it tends to be a whole lot more informal, because you're not just a board member, you're also sitting in the pews next to people on Sunday morning, and more importantly, you're drinking coffee with them after the service, right? That a lot of the board relations are not done in those formal ways, but are done in more informal ways. And frankly, every board that I know, unless anxiety is high and there is a conflict, experiences attempts at more formal communication as having almost no effect. I don't know how many of y'all have had town halls on the budget that nobody came to, and then everybody was mad about the budget at the congregational meeting. And that sense of frustration that comes from that, because people interact with the governing board in informal ways, and that the more successful communication strategies for governing boards leverage those informal relationships. Leverage the ability for board members to, in the middle of coffee hour, say, hey, did y'all get a chance to look at the budget? What'd y'all think about it? We worked pretty hard on it. And have that, because they're not going to come to the town hall meeting unless they're mad. And the people who are most motivated to come to the town hall meeting are going to come are going to give the board a unbalanced impression of where the congregation may actually be in relationship to whatever the issue is, because they had enough discomfort with whatever it is to get past the apathy to actually come to a formal communication session. Does that make sense to everyone? So what's needed in congregation is not linkage, but role clarity. It's to be able to say, in this moment, I'm acting as a board. I just switched in coffee hour from being just another congregant, and now I'm going to ask this question about what y'all think about the budget. I'm going to function as a board member for a minute. I'm doing that role clarity shift for me in this moment. They may not know what I'm doing, but I know what I'm doing. I know that in this moment, I'm switching over and using the last half of this cup of coffee to do some of my board linkage work. So board members, I believe, should be full active participants in the life of the congregation and should listen to the congregation through that participation and do so while striving to maintain their identity as a board member. So next slide. In doing that, you have to have some agreements amongst you as a board about how you're going to interact with the congregation and how you're going to interact with each other. Once again, this is the thing, when I come and do a board retreat or things with congregations, I'll spend a good hour and a half to 2 hours on board covenants and do work to help boards come up with those agreements. But I want to just do a quick momentary introduction, is that serving on a congregational board is a form of spiritual leadership. You, as board members of Unitarian Universalist congregations, you are the religious leaders of our liberal faith tradition in the communities you serve. We often think it's the ministers, and yes, ministers are religious leaders, and bless them, right? But in our tradition, both in the universal side of our tradition and the Unitarian side of our tradition, we rest religious leadership in our lay leadership. Our pilgrim ancestors fled to this country to get away from bishops, among other things. So there is to own that the work you do is not administrative. It's got administrative pieces to it, but the work you do is religious as a member of a governing board. I tell congregational governing boards that you are the holders of the franchise of this faith tradition that I love within the community you serve. And you're the keepers of the mission of the congregation, and you practice the ideal of the fifth principle. So serving as religious leaders and your work being religious and spiritual in its nature means it's a different kind of relationship you have with each other. The best boards I've ever seen have been boards that functioned as covenant groups, that were a ministry together, that had a ministry of living the values and ideals and promoting the values and ideals of Unitarian Universalism within the community they serve, not just the congregational community, but the wider community, the city, the town, the county, the state. And doing so means to recognize, one of the ways we recognize the religious nature of your work is to see it as covenantal. Now, covenant's one of those words. I had somebody once tell me, when I asked them what covenant meant, they said, well, it's what ministers say we call agreements at church. I'm going to give you a little bit more, because I think there's truth to that, but there's another piece to it, and that is that it is relationship amidst something that binds us together that is more than we are, that is larger than ourselves, that calls us to this work. Now, in Hebraic tradition, the covenant, that vertical in the covenant, that covenant was always in light of God, but that's not who we are, at least not all of us. I think the covenant for us, that binding thing that binds us together, is the mission and vision of the congregation. Is, to me, the vision of the world made whole that we are trying to create in this world, in this time. So covenant is the promises that you as board members make to one another in light of that vision of the world made whole, in light of trying to live the congregation's mission and vision. And so you make these promises to each other. And covenant is not something that you know, like I said before about my wife's Zen practice, it's not a legalistic document, it's a relational document. It's meant to call you back into relationship with one another. So a board covenant should be about more than behavior. It should be about those promises. but it usually has some behavior stuff in it. One of my best lines that I ever saw in a board covenant was one that said, "We will recognize when someone cries. We will stop and recognize a moment when someone cries. We will stop and recognize when someone laughs. We will stop and recognize when someone is uncomfortable." That's a kind of promise, right? It's not all just about we won't do business in email, or or we will not use more than one capital letter in a sentence in an email, which is another thing I saw. All capital emails, if it's got all capitals, don't send it. I'm going to stop there with board covenant because we can do some additional teaching about this. It's just the idea that the promises you make to each other are in light of a wider vision and in light of your role as the religious leaders of Unitarian Universalism in the communities you serve. So Beth, I think you're going to talk us through the next one for a few minutes.
So speaking as a board, sometimes, often in a covenant, this comes up as speak as one voice, or how you're going to speak together as a board. When you serve on a congregational board, it's more complex than serving on any other kind of governing board because of that unique relationship between membership and leadership and the overlapping roles and responsibilities that you have. So as a board, you need to agree how you're going to communicate with the congregation about your decisions. You're going to have formal communications such as your agenda, minutes, your linkage, availability. You may have policies about how things get posted and shared. And you're also going to have that informal communication, that coffee hour conversation. And the ideal here is that when someone corners you in coffee hour, that you're going to say, you're not going to undermine the decisions that the board made because you didn't vote the way most people did, or something like that. You can't allow that informal communication to override the formal communications. So there's two primarily healthy styles of informal board communication. One is an agreement that you'll speak as one board. Once a decision is made and a vote is taken and the board says we're going to do X, you only speak in public and to members of the congregation in support of X, regardless of how you voted and how you felt during the discussion. Another is to speak to the process. So in other words, you'll talk about how, well, we had this long conversation and we talked about, we had some investigation into these different options and this is how we came about with the decision, without actually saying, and I voted no and they all decided yes, or I voted yes and they all decided no, or whatever. Either way helps support the fact that the board made this decision and that's the decision, and not I'm unhappy and I have an axe to grind and now I'm going to go out and spread discontent among my fellow congregational members. So boards need an agreement on how they're going to conduct those informal communications. That in the process of creating your covenant and in your conversations, you agree, this is how we're going to be. We're going to speak with one voice, we're going to speak as one board, or we're going to speak to the process. We're not going to undermine the decisions of the board put together.
Because to undermine the decisions of the board damages the board's authority going forward.
Right.
It's about protecting the authority of the governing board within the congregation.
And it's about trust as well. The congregants aren't going to trust the board's decisions if they keep hearing that so-and-so voted differently and didn't get, they're going to infer things into that. Well, did you not get heard? Did you get yelled down? There's going to be stuff inferred into that that's probably not true.
Yep.
So that's part of it too.
So I'm going to make a decision to delay our discussion about voting process and consensus process to the next session to make sure that we end on time. It will not be lost. I always build extra space into the last session so that I can bump something if I need to. And remember, this is the first time we're doing this as a webinar, so we're learning as we go. So I won't be lost, but I want to go to healthy conflict for boards. Voting process and consensus process affects healthy conflict, but it's a little deeper than that. And, the thing I wanted to name is that all congregations and all congregational boards experience conflict. All of them do. And if they don't, then they're really conflict averse, and that's a whole different problem. Conflict itself is normal and it's healthy if you engage it in healthy ways. And conflict is vital and beneficial to a congregation when it's engaged well. Conflict is where good transformation comes from. Conflict is divisive and damaging to a congregation only when it's engaged poorly. Now, not everybody may engage it well at the same time, but one of the great things about governing boards as compared to a whole congregation is you've got a much better shot of having a group of people who can engage conflict well within the governing board than having everybody in the congregation being able to engage conflict well. So boards are one of the places where it's actually healthier to have more conflict, to do that work within the board, because you've got a better chance of having good, healthily engaged congregation in the smaller trusted group of leaders. That's not always true, and that's something to work towards. Not everybody is always in the same place. We're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to do healthy conflict in a minute. Systems that seek to ignore or suppress conflict are often stuck feeling. Congregations that feel like they can't move forward tend to be the ones who don't have the capacity to engage conflict well. Either they've engaged it poorly in the past and are now traumatized and afraid of anything that looks like conflict going forward, or that they do difficult, unhealthy conflict all the time, and that's the chaotic environment they live in. So creating conflict can be a way for some to exercise unhealthy power in a system. So there are times where, some people who really do well in unhealthy conflict like to create an unhealthy conflict because it supports their ability to get what they want. That's really true in a lot of conflict-averse systems, who would rather give in to the person than actually have the conflict. It's a great way to get what you want. So healthy conflict, next slide please, is having an attitude that conflict is healthy and that it's a chance to grow. Disputants are clearly able to see the difference between the people and the problems. In other words, being differentiated, as we discussed earlier. Communication is open and people speak directly to one another, and everyone has access to necessary information, which is healthy disclosure. Naming, if you didn't see, we've been leading up to this last set of slides, the whole workshop. In unhealthy conflict, congregations having an attitude that conflict is wrong or dangerous. This is true in a lot of our congregations. It's even more true in some of the congregations I've worked with in more Christian and Protestant-centered traditions, for whom conflict could actually be seen as sinful, right, as that level of conflict. It's disputants quickly mix people and problems together and assume that changing or removing people solves the problem. I will say that congregations who end up in conflict and call me and say that they need to get rid of the minister as the first step in the solution are dealing with some of this. The sense that the person is the problem, not the system, not the root sources. And communication is diminished and indirect, and information is used as a tool of power in the conflict, in unhealthy conflict, so that what I know becomes part of my power to get what I want within the conflict, not part of what we are all engaging to try and find our way to a consensus solution. Go to the next slide. So back to healthy conflict for a minute. In healthy conflict systems, the balance sheet is short. So what that means is that disputants address the issues that are alive in the current conflict, and they don't bring in issues from the past. Well, this is just like what happened 25 years ago when Bob did this, right? In a healthy situation, that doesn't happen. In healthy conflict, there is give and take of ideas among disputants, and the spirit of cooperation is there to help find a solution. And there is careful listening and speaking. And usually it's because in that healthy conflict, people have a broader ideal that is drawing them together. I think one of the things, I do a lot of work with congregations in conflict. And one of the things that I think is the most unifying is a well-understood mission and vision that people have been able to integrate. Congregations that know why they're a congregation tend to do healthy conflict better, because people are better able to do that give and take of ideas. When I talk about why mission and vision is so important for governing boards and congregations to do, it's in part because it is one of the key elements of being able to do healthy conflict. And resolution will take whatever time is needed to engage the community in the issue and dispute. In unhealthy conflict, the balance sheet is usually long. I talked about that a few minutes ago, that things are brought in that weren't part of this at all, but have been brought in because in unhealthy conflict, what people are experiencing is every conflict the congregation has ever had. So it feels like the fight from 25 years before. And so what happened in the fight from 25 years before is brought back into this conflict. People speak mostly with those to whom they already agree. If that's not a recipe for some of the conflict in our country, I don't know what is. But they don't seek out the opportunity to hear from people in other aspects of the congregation, other views than in the dispute. The congregation feels reactive when disputants cannot agree on what the actual problem is, and there is a strong desire in unhealthy conflict to resolve the issue quickly, because we don't want to be in this discomfort. And the only way we know to be out of this discomfort is to solve the problem. Which is why in congregational conflicts, in human beings, there tend to be three major reactions to anxiety, to conflict: fight, flight, freeze. The 5 people fight in the middle of the in the middle of the congregational meeting. The freeze people are in the kitchen making coffee, and the flee people have left the church, right? So to understand that healthy conflict is generative. It is where transformation and good ideas, a good healthy conflict, well engaged, can be transformative and energizing in a congregation. And so few of our congregations have ever experienced that when I say that, they look at me like I'm crazy. So I recognize that that's not in our experience. So next slide, and we're about to finish. The keys to healthy conflict as congregational boards is awareness of the difference between adaptive challenge and technical problems and how to address each. It is maintaining the balcony view of recognizing the dance floor views of disputants. It is seeing yourself as differentiated from the conflict and the emotional system while remaining engaged with the congregation and actively working not to personalize the conflict or react when others personalize it, to be the white blood cells in the congregational system. It's healthy disclosure of information available in the conflict and not using necessary confidential information as sources of power. It's actively working to maintain open dialogue in the conflict, and it's being clear on the process and expectations as a board, being clear on your covenant, on your commitments, and your ideas. So all of this workshop is intended to be a primer in healthy conflict within congregations. I want to thank you all for coming tonight and being with us. The resource slide is up. We are once again available for questions by email and phone calls. And thank you all for being with us tonight, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Be well.
Okay, bye. Leave the meeting.
Thank you.